evening, Birds, Bees, and Butterflies is really an incarnation. No, it's not. It was pulled together by a very important person named Clara Calitri, who's sitting in the front row, and a number of you know her. If you look in the back, there are some of her beautiful art. She's a person who, flowers is what I think of when I think of Clara. But she's really concerned about the things that are related to flowers, bees, butterflies, and birds. And so this is a focus tonight. We'll be focusing on bees tonight, but she'll be having a showing at the Town Hall Theater in June. She'll be giving out seeds so you can plant some wonderful flowers that the birds, bees, and butterflies will like. So Clara, you can bow later on. I'm not gonna. Otherwise, I just would like to give you a little introduction about our speaker tonight. As I say, it's birds, bees, and butterflies in the land of milk and honey. We know that refers to where we are. Challenges and what we might do to help with that. So this evening we have Ross Conrad, who's going to be speaking to us. I wasn't going to say this, but his whole educational background, he went to a technical school, he got a BS in broadcast communications. Life sometimes sends us in a whole different way. And I think he met somebody named Charles Mraz, and all of a sudden keeping bees was something that was really his passion. And I think that's just spectacular. So he really learned his craft through working with Charlie Mraz, who's since died, but his son Bill from Champlain Apiary is here in town. So Conrad is a former president of the Vermont Beekeepers Association. He's a regular columnist, that's interesting, for Bee Culture magazine. He's the author of Natural Beekeeping, Organic Approaches to Modern Apiculture. I'm here to learn tonight. And he's currently co-writing a book on the history of Vermont beekeeping, which is going to be published this year, so that's exciting. He's done presentations regarding bees throughout all of North America, done classes and workshops, so he's very knowledgeable in that area. And we need to keep this going because he's got a lot to say to us tonight. So I think anything further, you're on. Nice to have you.
Good evening, folks. You can hear me okay? Hopefully this thing's working. Thanks for coming out, and thanks also to the homeschool students here that are running the camera for MCTV tonight, and to the homeschool parents for everything you do. I'm a big believer in homeschooling, so I appreciate you guys being here. And as I was saying, it's funny how life goes. I never would have expected that I'd be living a life of bees, if you will. I'm not an entomologist, didn't study in school, and in fact, I was a DJ. And one winter, I was DJing at a night spot near a resort, or the Killington area, basically. And it was great because, work a few hours every night, had my days totally free, no responsibilities all day long. And I found myself, I did a lot of skiing, but I also found myself doing a lot of soul searching and just looking at the world, at the state of the world, and what I saw, the path things seemed to be leading to. And I was doing a lot of reading. I was drawn to a lot of books by a native elder named Sunbear, who had a community and a teaching center in Spokane, Washington area, where he taught native wisdom to anyone who wanted to learn. And so that winter I decided I was going to maybe save some of the money I was making and next summer go out and spend some time with the bear tribe and try to learn some native wisdom. And while I was out there, I had the chance to participate in what's called a vision quest. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with the vision quest. It's kind of a rite of passage into adulthood that an indigenous person coming of age would go through. A lot of Native people believe that everything in the natural world has something to teach us, if we're open to it in our hearts, in our minds. And so trying to keep with the spirit of things, I looked at this bee and said, well, what do you have to teach me? And it started flying around me and landing on various parts of my body and flying around, landing on me for several minutes before it flew off. It's like, that was kind of weird. Never had that happen before. Didn't think much more about it until the next day. I was sitting in the exact same spot. And I hear bzz, bzz, and I look, and this bee's flying off as if to say, don't forget what I told you. But I didn't have a clue how to speak bee back then, so I didn't know what was going on. And so I came back here to Middlebury, and it was about 6 or 7 months later, kind of out of the blue, Bill Mraz, who is a local beekeeper, and I'd helped with some part-time work a few years earlier, just for a couple months. He asked me if I wanted to work full-time doing bees. And quite frankly, I think most people in their right mind don't jump at a career opportunity to work with millions of stinging insects that could potentially kill you. But because I had that experience, I decided to take the job. And it was a whole new education for me. Bill and his father Charlie, between them they had over 100 years of beekeeping experience. And it was just wonderful. And right at that time was when I started working with them. It was the early 1990s, and Varroa mites were spreading throughout the United States and came to Vermont and were wiping out hives. And it was a tough time. Unfortunately, the beekeeping industry was the last of all the agricultural groups to turn to pesticides to control pests. And they hadn't learned from all those other agricultural groups. Whenever we use pesticides to control pests, the way nature works, they always develop resistance to the pesticides. And then we have to use greater concentrations or more toxic pesticide chemicals, and it's kind of a never-ending cycle. And so, when you work for someone else and you want to keep your job, you do what they ask you to do. But with my own bees, I just never would use them. It just didn't feel right to me. I didn't like it. And I lost a lot of bees. They died. And it took a lot of experimenting and work to try to figure out how to keep the bees alive without using the pesticides to kill the mites and the antibiotics to control disease and feeding them an artificial diet all the time. And finally, after quite a bit of experimentation, I finally got to the point, let me get this thing working maybe, there we go, where I started keeping them alive more often than not, and that's what gave me the inspiration to write what ended up being the first book on organic beekeeping to be published in the United States, Natural Beekeeping. Although it came out with the second edition just 4 or 5 years ago, because so much has changed since when it first came out in 2007. And right when the book was coming out, we were hearing about more bee losses and declines. And so that's why I wanted to share with you a little bit this evening about all the pollinators, really, which is why it's about birds, bees, butterflies. We have moths. A lot of people don't realize moths are important pollinators. Flies are important pollinators. Of course, with bumblebees, butterflies, because they're so beautiful, they get a lot of attention. And the monarch probably is the most loved of all the butterflies, which unfortunately has seen serious steep declines in recent years. And birds, hummingbirds are important pollinators. Even bats in certain areas are important pollinators. And even small mammals. In Hawaii, there are flowers that are so large, there are small rodents that will suck the nectar like a big vase, and as they get the pollen on their whiskers, they spread it around from plant to plant. And so, as a result, the pollinator-plant relationship has evolved for millions of years. And it's gotten to the point where the vast majority of all the plants on the planet require some form of pollination. And most of those plants that require pollination by some kind of critter, right? The plants have realized early on, I guess, that it's much more efficient to deliver the package and have a messenger deliver that package than to just throw the pollen in the air and hope that it's going to land in the right place to pollinate the flowers so we can get all the fruits and vegetables and nuts and berries and all the abundance that is produced by the plants for all the other insects and animals and all of us as well. And so the pollinators are actually so important to life on the planet as we know it today, literally. Anybody hear of the quote by Albert Einstein, something about the bees go, then people will go after that? Anybody hear about that? Few people? Well, there's a quote out there, and Actually, I looked into it, and it doesn't seem to be a real quote by Albert Einstein. The best I can do is find it. Goes back to about the 1990s, and from France, someone came up with it, I think, to make a political point, because Albert Einstein was a really smart guy, so people tend to pay attention to what he said, but the reality is, I think if there were no pollinators, there'd be a lot less variety of foods. I don't think all people would disappear. We probably wouldn't be able to support the kind of population we have now, but it wouldn't be the total end of the world, but things would definitely change dramatically, that's for sure. There's still a lot of wind-pollinated plants, for example, mostly cereal grains and things like that. So the land of milk and honey is the other part of this, and that's, when we talk about the land of milk and honey, that goes back even way back to the Bible, right? It talked about the land of milk and honey, and that was actually in what now is desert in the Middle East. That was the land of milk and honey once. And what that denotes is, if you can produce milk, that means there's grass for ruminants, right? If you're producing honey, there's a lot of plants that are flowering and support bees. And so it's a rich, lush, wonderful place to live. The earth is just abundant and producing if you live in a land of milk and honey. And we're so blessed here in Addison County, and pretty much all of Vermont anyway, because we also live in a land of milk and honey. In fact, there was a sign on the side of Route 7 as you come from Burlington up to Middlebury back in the 80s that I remember seeing my first trips to Vermont, and it said, as you pass from Chittenden to Addison County, it said, "Welcome to Addison County, the land of milk and honey." And if anyone, by the way, knows of a photo of that, I would love to get that, because I'm working on, as was mentioned earlier, working on a book on the history of beekeeping in Vermont. And that would be a really cool, I'd like to see that on the cover of the book, actually. And so, people have had a relationship with the pollinators, primarily the bees. But we have a relationship with the pollinators because they produce so much of our food, really. Even though studies have shown that honeybees are directly responsible for about a third of everything we eat, we get a lot of free pollinator service from all the native pollinators, the birds, the butterflies, the moths, the beetles, the flies, and all the other pollinators. Too numerous to mention. But unfortunately, there's some problems. We're losing our pollinators. The bees' colony collapse symptoms, with this latest mass die-off and pretty dramatic reduction in bee, increase in bee losses by beekeepers. It has a certain set of symptoms that some of the symptoms had not been observed before in other previous die-offs of bees that have occurred throughout history. And in particular, the delay in the usual scavenger activity as a hive is declining, there's not enough bees to guard the entrance. Other critters will try to sneak in and steal the honey, whether it's other bees from other hives or wasps, hornets, or whatever. Even small hive beetles and wax moths and things will try to get in. And usually the hive is a strong population, they can defend the entrance and repel those invaders. But when a hive is declining, they can't, and then those scavengers can get in and cause problems. But when a hive is declining from what is termed colony collapse disorder, we don't see that kind of scavenger activity. There's actually a delay in the amount of time the scavengers will kind of go after a hive of several weeks, like as if they know something is wrong and they're staying away from the hive. And the other thing that we notice is that's consistent among colony collapse is that all the bees that are left, if there are any bees left in the hive alive, they're sick. They have viral infections, fungal infections. They're not healthy bees. It's like their immune systems are very compromised. And so my whole approach as a beekeeper and beekeeping in general is we're trying to work to prop up the immune system of the honeybees so they can deal with whatever it is that's affecting them and making them more vulnerable to pathogens and diseases. And we're having mixed results. Losses, starting since back in 2010-11, there's been this group through the USDA and Penn State and doing a nationwide survey of beekeepers to keep tabs on the losses of bees throughout the years. And this is particularly for Vermont, since every state is broken out, covers about 20 to 25% of the hives in the state, because it's a voluntary thing that beekeepers could participate in or not. But usually back in the day, years ago, back 60s, 70s, when you kept bees over the winter, you might lose 3-5% would be a big loss over the winter. But then when the mites came, beekeepers started to lose a lot more hives, and it became more normal to lose 10, 15, maybe 20% during the winter in a bad year. But recently, with this new colony collapse or symptoms and related issues, the average is more like 30 to 40%. In Vermont, it's not always that bad, luckily, although you can see it's different in the summer, in the winter. And usually in the summer, bees should be doing fine, but we're starting to lose high numbers of bees in the summer as well, which is a big concern, because that's usually the time they're healthy and thriving. And so, there's been a lot of research, money being put into more research, thankfully, actually hearings in Congress for the first time on bees and beekeeping and the industry and the state of things, and a lot of media coverage, and thankfully a lot of interest by people. More people than ever have become involved in beekeeping, wanting to get bees, learn about beekeeping, to try to help the bees and the pollinators, because they realize how important they are. And so there's a number of things that are affecting the bees and the pollinators and stressing them. A big thing is land development. According to researchers, anywhere from 1/2 to 2/3 of our land-based ecosystem is required to maintain stability of the ecosystems. And we've already basically used up about half, according to the scientists out there. So we're right on the edge here. If we're really going to have a long-term stability in basically supporting the life on the planet as we know it, we're going to have to perhaps look at changing the way we utilize land and develop land. Everything from forests and how we utilize the forests, to industry and mining, and even just development with businesses and parking lots and roads and everything that affects land. All those things have big effects. Another thing that affects bees is the global economy. We have this economy now where we're so interconnected all around the world, and we're moving goods all around the world, even services all around the world. And as a result, we're also moving diseases around the world. Often inadvertently, we don't mean to, and there's often regulations to try to prevent these things, but things happen. It happens. And that's with bees in particular. We know there's a number of diseases that have come to the United States that weren't here before. And even with bumblebees. Bumblebees are also a commercially available livestock. Mostly folks in the greenhouse industry will buy bumblebees to pollinate certain crops in greenhouses, because bumblebees are really good at that, much better than, honeybees aren't really effective in greenhouses. They need a big open space to fly for miles around. But bumblebees work great in greenhouses. And bumblebees have been brought over from Europe, and it turns out that some of those bees, we believe, had diseases that existed in Europe that weren't here. And then, of course, when the bees are here, they get out and get into the wild, and then the diseases spread. So that's just one example of how pollinators are being affected by the global economy and the spread of diseases. Pests, of course, are another one. In this picture here, these three little dots on that pearly white larva of the bee there, those are mites. The Rowell mite is a big stressor for bees these days. And one of the main things that beekeepers, one of the main pests other than bears here in Vermont, that we have to deal with and try to keep under control so that our bees have a chance of surviving. Because the mites They don't really kill the bee, but they weaken the bee's immune system to the point where the bees are more likely to get diseases, pick up those pathogens, and get sick. And that ends up being what kills them. So another big stressor is our climate changing. It's definitely happening. All the evidence points to that. It's clear. And it seems to be because of the greenhouse gas emissions that are a big part of our everyday lives, right? Carbon is the big one, the most common one, because we've increased the carbon in the atmosphere over 40% now. But there are other greenhouse gases that are really important to keep in mind too. Methane, which is primary from natural gas, and natural gas extraction is very potent, dozens of times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of the greenhouse gas for warming the climate. And interestingly enough, the refrigerants we use are thousands of times, it turns out, more potent than carbon dioxide. Paul Hawkins talks about this in his book, Drawdown, where the number one thing we should be looking at, in his opinion, in the book, was looking at refrigerants, not just in our refrigerators, but in our air conditioners at home or in the car, but even refrigerants in the new air heat source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, the new technology to use renewable energy, electricity produced by solar, to produce heat. Those refrigerants, as long as we're very careful, maintain our equipment well, don't let those gases escape, it'll be good. But we need to be aware of that and stay on top of that, because those refrigerants apparently are super, super potent greenhouse gases. Just to go, before I jump ahead here, the problem with climate is that it's affecting pollinators not just the obvious way when you have more extreme weather events, right? We know about the floods that can wipe out habitats and hives, the droughts which cause all the flowers to dry up so there's no food for the pollinators. We know about the heavy winds that can cause problems. But it turns out that scientists have found that plants in an atmosphere, growing in an atmosphere of high carbon dioxide, produce a lot less protein and a lot more sugars and starches. And they've found that, for example, in goldenrod, the protein content of the pollen from goldenrod has dropped dramatically over the last 40, 50 years because of the change in our climate in terms of the gas, just the gas thing. So that's affecting pollinator nutrition. No one's really looked at how it's even going to affect human nutrition. It also means the plants are going to have less protein for people as well, right? It's for everything. So that's definitely a concern. Another thing with climate changing is the seasons are shifting. Plants are blooming at different times. I don't know if you've noticed, the USDA plant hardiness zone map has actually been changed a second time now in just 10, 20 years. Things are shifting pretty dramatically enough that we can plant things now that can grow in Vermont that we never used to be able to, which can be looked at as a good thing, but there are some certain drawbacks to that. And one of those is, plants and pollinators have evolved to kind of coexist with each other. There are certain pollinators that come out of hibernation in the winter at a certain time of the year when they expect to find certain plants in bloom, because that's always the way it's been. And that's how they've survived. And now when they come out, but those plants bloom maybe a month earlier because it's abnormally warm, and they're done, those pollinators are going to have severe nutritional stress because the food that they come to rely on is not going to be there in an abundance that they're used to. And so it's a real challenge in terms of climate. I want to talk a bit about pesticides and genetically modified organisms, because that's another major stressor on pollinators and insects. In particular, the neonicotinoid pesticides, which are the new family that have been developed because they're much safer for people. Much safer. We can metabolize nicotine pretty well, which is what these pesticides are based on, the neonicotinoids. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, depending on your perspective, they're hyper-toxic for insects. Some of them, the most common neonicotinoid insecticide, which is imidacloprid, is actually 7,000 times more toxic to bees than DDT. And clothianidin, which is the one that they use for the seed coating primarily, for a lot of corn, soy, canola, that kind of thing, that one is 10,000 times more toxic to bees than DDT. So these are hyper toxic, and they're water soluble, which means the seed has coated with the pesticide and other things as well, gets put in the ground, and the water dissolves it, and as the plant grows, it soaks up some of that pesticide and it takes it throughout the whole plant. So they're systemic, and every part of the plant picks up some of the pesticide. So they're very effective at killing the pests. Unfortunately, they're indiscriminate, and they also affect the pollinators, for example. And so it's not like in the old days with some of the nasty chemicals we've used. You wouldn't spray when the bees are foraging because you wouldn't want to hurt the bees, and then maybe they break down pretty readily or whatever, and that way you could sort of limit the exposure to the pollinators. With these systemic pesticides, unfortunately, you can't limit their exposure because it's in the plant, throughout the whole plant, all the time it's growing, and they're going to be exposed. So that's a big challenge these days because these pesticides are very effective and very popular. They're the most widely used insecticides of all the insecticides being used. You had a question?
Yes, and so once the plant is done growing, then what's happening with those pesticides? Are they're going down to the water table?
Well, they're still most actually about 3 to 5% of the pesticide in terms of the seed treatments for those plants. Only 3 to 5% of the pesticide actually ends up in the plant. The rest is in the soil. It gets into the water. Our own Department of Ag is starting to find it in some streams and our rivers, and it's getting into the waterways. There's concern now, how's that going to affect the water-based insects, and then the fish and the birds that rely on those insects.
Do they break down eventually?
Eventually, but slowly. It depends on how much they're exposed to sun, but we do know they can last for years in the environment. Depends on the soil type, a lot of factors. And the other problem is that it's spreading to the other plants that weren't treated. So, on the edge of the field, like the tree that's there, if the water that is dissolving some of the pesticide happens to flow underground past that tree is soaking it up, and now that tree is full of pesticide. And so any pollinator that visits that tree when it's in bloom, there's been cases where a lot of bumblebees are found dead under our trees in the spring, and we're wondering, what's going on here, even though it's right next to a field with a farmer's plant. I mean, these are legal. The farmers aren't doing anything wrong. This is all supposed to have been vetted by our regulatory agencies, who aren't really doing the kind of job, I think, what we expect from them, quite personally. So, industrial agriculture is definitely a big part of the issue, not just in terms of the land use and the pesticides, but even just in the fact that those things are destroying all the native pollinators, so we have to rely on honeybees. This is a picture of almond trees, almond groves out in California. There's a place in California where it turns out it's about 8 to 900,000 acres. And this area is just perfect for raising almonds. The soil is right, the temperature and the climate is right. They don't have enough water because it's the desert, but they are able to divert some of the Colorado River for irrigation. And so as a result, California produces somewhere around 80% of the world's almond crop. Almost all the almonds very well are grown in California. And they bloom, they're just finished blooming actually, right around February and into early March here, is the time when the almonds bloom, as you can see. And during that time, there's unfortunately nothing else, it's winter. So it's not like there's pollinators there that can do the work. To get the almonds We need pollination, so bees have to be brought in. And in fact, it is the largest single pollinator event that goes on anywhere in the world each year. Basically, to get almonds, the almond orchardists like to have about 2 hives per acre to get a good almond set. So you do the math, they've got 800,000 to 900,000 acres. We're talking 1.5 to 2 million hives of bees are needed in this area of California during the almond bloom to pollinate the almond trees. Now, there's only about 2.5, 2.7 million hives in the whole United States. Okay, so they have to be trucked in. And unfortunately, in our capitalist system, we don't necessarily get what's best. We get what people can make money doing. And so to make money moving bees, we have to do it in mass. And so we tend to keep the hives on pallets, usually 4 to 8 hives on a pallet, depending on how you manage them. And that way they can be moved quickly with forklifts. And we load them onto big 18-wheeler tractor-trailer trucks so we can take them across country. And then, you can get 400 to 600 hives on a truck, depending on how you pack them and how you manage them. But when you're driving down the road, it's not good PR to be leaving a trail of angry bees to every town you go through. So we take a big net and we put it over the back of the truck to kind of keep the bees contained. But they're getting jostled around and they come out and they get into the net and they're buffeted by the wind and the rain and the sun can beat down them during the day. And we got to be careful they don't overheat or they can die. So we actually will spray water all over the hive so as the water evaporates, it helps cool the hive. But then at night, of course, it gets cold. So they're getting this hot, cold, and it's really stressful on the bees. When they get to their location in California, usually they unload in a big field we call a holding yard, because the reality is, unfortunately, it's so stressful on the bees that about 10% of the hives die en route just to get out there to California. And that's just, kind of factored into the business model. They expect it. So when we get there, we unload the hives, go through them, have to weed out the dead hives, equalize them so the strong ones and the weak ones are all about the same strength. And then finally, of course, when they're there and they're one big field, the almonds haven't even started blooming yet, so there's nothing to eat. We have to feed them, and we don't typically feed them what they're meant to eat, which is pollen and honey. We give them substitutes like sugar syrup and protein patties. So this, it's better than nothing, but it's not the best food for healthy bees. And then finally we bring them into the orchards and they get to forage on real blossoms, to get real nectar, real pollen, real quality, nutritious food. But it's really limited, It's only almonds. It'd be like if you could eat something healthy like kale, but that's all you can eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 7 days a week, for 4 or 5 weeks. Now that's basically what we're doing to the bees. So it's amazing they're able to survive, actually, as well as they have, quite frankly. And it's not like beekeepers want to do this to their bees, right? Beekeepers don't want to do this, but they have no choice. This is the industrial food system that we have developed and all have come to rely on for our food. We have to do this. The native pollinators aren't there in the kind of quantity we need to pollinate, and so the only way we're going to get that food is to bring in those bees. And so it's our whole system of food, which actually is very fragile, actually, because it's relying on bees right now. I mean, if the bees go away, we'll have a lot less food. And so it's really important and something to be thinking about every time you go and purchase food. Where does that food come from? What kind of system is it supporting? These are the kind of things that it's good to be thinking about.
Do you bring the bees all the way back again, or you just?
Oh yeah, well usually the migratory guys will then go and hit other crops, maybe apples in Washington, and there's citrus down in Florida, and peaches in Georgia, and they work their way up. There's cranberries and
So they
Massachusetts, and usually they end up in Maine with the blueberries.
Okay, all right. So then they end up having a happy life eventually.
We hope.
Yeah.
And so, we've talked about some of the systems that are a problem, not just the agricultural system, but our economic system and the way we use energy and develop things. But really, the underlying cause of the problem, it's standing here in front of you. And sitting in your seat. You know, we're all part of this culture and society, and we all participate in it. And therefore, for me, it dawned on me that, you know, I'm actually part of the problem. And that's actually empowering. Because when I realize that I am also contributing in ways to these problems, then I can be part of the solution. Because if I'm not part of the problem, right, that's someone else's issue, let them deal with it, I don't have to change a thing. But when I realize, no, wait a minute, yeah, I'm part of this too, then it becomes part of my responsibility to see what can I do, what can I change to help improve things and make things better for our pollinators. And there's a lot of things that we could potentially be doing. In terms of toxins in the environment, for example, you know, if we're not working for the pesticide companies, we're often using products, pesticides ourselves, right? Or we're perhaps buying products from other people that they use the pesticides. It's one of the reasons why, whenever possible, I always look for organic, biodynamic, or permaculturally grown fruits, vegetables, meats, whatever it is, because those tend to use minimal or no pesticides. And what's really great about reducing the pesticide use is you get a twofer. Because it turns out pesticides kill the soil organisms, which are critical for helping plants to sequester and pull carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in the soil, which is what is going to be needed if we're going to be able to rebalance the climate and get a lot of it, because it's not just about using, you know, less fossil fuels, it's also about, and I'm jumping ahead here, but it's also about putting what the carbon that's in the atmosphere back in the soil. And so, in terms of toxins, as I mentioned, whenever possible, I try to, you know, buy from those that aren't using the pesticides.
What does biodynamic?
Biodynamic is a form of agriculture that has a strong spiritual component in it. There's a bunch of books out there. Rudolf Steiner is one of the fathers of biodynamics, and it's a way of kind of growing and working with nature to grow food that also has a spiritual component. And again, it's like beyond organic, if you will. Hard to explain.
It's biodynamic compost.
Yeah, exactly. That's a whole nother talk. Buying local can be helpful too, because, you know, there's also that way you know your farmer, right? You know, you can talk to them. You know, are they using a lot of pesticides or not, right? Plus, there are less food miles where it has to travel. Although there has been some research that has indicated potentially a local crop that is grown very energy intensively with a lot of chemicals and stuff could actually have more impact on the climate than organically grown crop grown in California but then shipped over. Just because there is, interestingly enough, you know, there can be a lot of energy and carbon climate footprint in different farming practices and techniques. Let's see, growing your own, I mean, that's probably the least footprint that you can get, pretty much. And that's one of the things I love about bees. Of all the foods, actually honey, local honey, has one of the smallest carbon footprints of pretty much any food. Because beekeepers are not plowing and tilling and planting and buying new seed and doing all the bees are doing all that work. So there's not a lot of energy put in during the course. I mean, yes, we visit the bees and we take care for them, but other than the beekeeper traveling to the hives, there's not a lot of carbon impact on the environment, which is one of the things that helps inspire me as a beekeeper. We can also be supporting legislation that decreases pesticide use. I know the state of Vermont's been looking at that. And some municipalities can even do that around the country. Some municipalities have banned certain chemicals and pesticides. And then, of course, when you vote, voting for candidates, I mean, there's probably more things that you could think of that we could be doing to help reduce the amount of pesticides that are sprayed in our environment. It's actually been increasing over the years. I know when they first came out with genetically engineered plants, they said it was going to help reduce it, but it hasn't. It's actually increased it because these plants tend to be genetically engineered to not be able to grow without the pesticides. And then the other problem, of course, is the insects are developing resistance to the ones we're using, so we have to use more or more toxic pesticides, and we don't seem to be on the path that we were hoping to be on with that approach. Another thing we could be doing is increasing pollinator forage, which looks like it's spelled wrong. I can print that out. Just noticed that. So it's interesting for pollinators because they have to spend a lot of energy looking for food. And so if you're going to plant for pollinators, think in terms of clumps. You know, a 4-foot by 4-foot clumps of that flowering plant would be probably about ideal, if not bigger. Because it's us humans that can get away, the only ones that can get away with, the research says, burning about 10 calories of energy on average for every single food calorie we produce. And we've been able to do that because we've had abundant and relatively cheap fossil fuels to use. But if a bee burned 10 calories of energy looking for every single calorie of food they ever find, they would starve in no time. Right? It doesn't work very well. So when we plant things, think of large clumps. And then the next thing is diversity, which is really important. Any ideas, what do you think in terms of flower diversity for pollinators? What kind of things would be helpful? Any ideas?
You mean what types of plants?
Well, not so types, but just in general, in terms of diversity of plants, what should we be perhaps thinking of?
Different heights?
Different heights, different bloom times, right? Spring, summer, and fall. Ideally, having as many things in bloom as each of those times of year as possible. What else?
Mixture of flowers, trees, and shrubs.
Yeah, and that would provide different flower sizes and shapes, which is very important because different pollinators do better with different size and shapes flowers. What else could we be looking at? How about colors?
Yeah, she said that back there.
Oh, okay, I didn't hear that. Good, colors, great. Right, different colors.
Night blooming and day blooming.
Right, for moths especially, there actually are some plants that only bloom at night. They're pretty rare and they're very finicky, but they do exist. So yes, the more diversity we can provide as well, the better it's going to be for those pollinators when they come looking for food. And again, think of large clumps. So there's plenty of food available when the pollinator finally gets there. They can harvest more food energy than they spent to find that location. Another thing we can do to help the forage is just mow differently. Do we really need to mow every week? You know, even if you just cut back to every other week, it gives some of the dandelions, some of those other plants, clover and stuff in the lawn, a chance to bloom. When it's only grass, there's not a lot of life there, actually, other than the grass, you know. And so, ideally, the less you can mow, the better. Some people even just mow paths where they need to go, and they let the rest grow. And maybe once or twice a year, maybe they'll mow just to keep it from turning into a forest again. And if you're ideally, you know, you could even take some of your lawn, turn it into a garden. You know, with ideally perennials that you don't have to plant every year. It's less work for you and less mowing to do. And then there's less fossil fuel that gets burned. And then there's, of course, the old push mower for those of you who want to get a little extra exercise. That could be a way to mow without having to use the fossil fuels that you need to mow. So, primarily carbon footprint reduction actions that we could be thinking about that are going to help, not all of us, but including the pollinators. First of all, we're going to have to reduce our energy use, right? We use a lot, we waste so much. If we just stopped wasting so much energy, just how much we spend that we don't even really use. It's just wasted. We could actually do a lot in helping reduce our carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. Increasing energy efficiency. We've been a leader in Vermont on that with Efficiency Vermont. They're a utility that helps us to, whenever we're building or putting on renovations and things, we should be talking to them because they have different programs to help incentivize and help even pay for some of these efficiency upgrades. Switching to renewables, of course, is one that's a big focus, and just not using fossil fuels as much. And that, when it comes to personal use, that means I've been looking at everything from my diet and eating lower on the food chain and eating less meat, more fruits and vegetables that don't take so much energy, to how I get around and what kind of vehicle I drive and what it's powered by and how I'm heating my home. And there's a lot of, we can look at so many ways that we use fossil fuels. Supporting regenerative agriculture. This is a bit what I was talking about earlier. Regenerative agriculture is basically traditional agriculture, where we would feed the soil and build up the carbon and the organic matter in the soil, and the carbon gets sequestered in the soil. And that's what plants do, but they need healthy soil full of microbes. You realize a tablespoon of soil has more microbes and soil organisms in it than there are people on Earth, right? And there's what, 7-8 billion of us? So it's amazing. Healthy soil is amazing. It's full of life. But as long as we don't douse that soil with chemicals, which doesn't help the life in that soil works with the plants, because the plants will, during photosynthesis, actually take carbon from the atmosphere, turn it into sugars, and they exude those sugars through the plant roots, and they feed those micronutrients and the fungi and everything in the soil. And in fact, those soil organisms will work with the plants to get more of that, and they will actually, scientists have found, those organisms and fungi will actually bring water to the plant, they'll bring nutrients to the plant. They actually work a symbiotic relationship where they try to work with the plants, because the healthier the plant is, the healthier they're going to be, right? And so things that also help with the micronutrients in the soil and the life in the soil is cover crops and mulches. Bare soil actually causes carbon to be released from the soil, but if we keep the soil covered all the time, like typically happens in nature, that can help keep the carbon sequestered. Crop rotations, and not always planting the same thing. Just again, it's kind of like mimicking nature. In nature, we don't typically see a monoculture with just one thing. There's all kinds of things growing all the time, and sometimes in the same space, practically. And so mimicking that through rotating crops. And then no tilling or plowing. Whenever we till or plow, dig up the soil, we disturb the ecosystem that's in the soil, and all those microorganisms. And so that's what farmers are finding out. It not only helps with carbon, but it helps with water quality, which has been a big push in recent years here in Vermont. And farmers are starting to switch more to not tilling and plowing. And then, of course, minimal or no pesticide or synthetic fertilizer use, so that we can keep those microorganisms in the soil healthy. So, these are just some of the things and ideas I've been sharing with you. And one of the things that often comes up is, people often feel like, well, you're just one person, what kind of difference can you really make? Even on the state level, we're talking about maybe doing some of the regenerative agricultural things. But people are like, well, you're just one little state. We can't really make a big difference in this big world with so many other countries and states and everybody doing everything. And for the bees, they give me actual hope, because part of the reason we're in the situation we're in is because of what's called cumulative impacts, right? One person doing a little bit of harm, like burning a little fossil fuel in an internal combustion engine, one person doing that's not a big deal, totally insignificant. But today, we have billions of people doing it, and that is having a huge impact. And it's a similar thing in a beehive. It's been estimated that a single honeybee, working its entire life, can gather enough nectar to make 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. So it takes 12 bees working their whole lifetime, their whole output, to make 1 teaspoon that you get to enjoy in your coffee or your tea. Now, to get through an entire year here in Vermont, where we have long winters, bees need about 150 to 200 pounds of honey. They're very active, using a lot in the summer. They need a bunch to get through the winter. They need 200 pounds of honey, and yet a bee can only make 1/12 of a teaspoon. Seems totally insignificant. And yet the bee doesn't fall for the illusion that what they do is insignificant. Right? They do what they can do. They rely on their brothers and sisters in the hive to do what they do. And together, they can make miracles happen. Hundreds of pounds of honey sometimes. Right? And I think it was Mahatma Gandhi that pointed that out once. He said that what you do may seem insignificant, but it's important that you do it. It's important that you do it. And we all can play a role in doing something. And again, for me, when I'm thinking about what kind of things can I be doing, the bees act as such an amazing example and inspiration. Because if you look at how bees go about making their living, right? How do bees, what do they need to take from the world around them to survive? Anybody? Pat, I know you got some ideas. What do bees need to survive? Right? What do they eat? Pollen. Nectar, yeah. They also gather water, and they gather resins from trees that they convert into what we call propolis. And that, along with the air that they breathe and the warmth of the sun that they soak up, is all they need to survive. And yet, by taking those things that they need to survive, they don't hurt or kill anything. Not so much as a leaf on a plant is injured. I mean, they'll defend themselves with their stinger if they're threatened, but under normal conditions, they don't hurt anything, and yet they give back they give back through the act of pollination to create an abundance of fruits and nuts and berries and vegetables, all different shapes and sizes. So there's an abundance for all the other insects, all the animals, and all of us. So what a great lesson I'm always trying to work into my life is, first of all, how to do things so that I'm not doing any harm, or the least amount of harm possible. But secondly, the things I do should be things that help generate new life on Earth and help improve things to regenerate life rather than so much that seems to be degenerating life these days. And I tend to believe that each of you who cares for pollinators especially, and perhaps you want to become a beekeeper and do it in a more natural, organic fashion, so you're not using pesticides and antibiotics, which have sublethal impacts and cause some level of harm, even though they're helpful in other ways. When you help the pollinators in those ways, you are indirectly, through the pollinators, making the world a better place, right? And you're not just making the world a better place for yourself, or for other people even. You're making the world a better place for all of life on the planet. And that, to me, is the kind of healing that's sorely needed in this day and age. And this thing keeps going backwards on me. Oh, so I just wanted to end with that. And open it up in case any questions. Question over here, yeah?
Could you talk about wild bees?
Well, when you say wild bees,
Aren't there native bees that the bees beekeepers keep them, aren't there like wild type of bees?
okay, so my understanding is somewhere around 4,000 species of bees just in North America. And the bees that beekeepers keep are basically European honeybees, so they're actually not even native.
Yeah.
There was a native honeybee in North America at one point that found fossilized evidence of that, but it existed like 40 million years ago, and it died out for some reason. So the only honeybees, other than the stingless honeybee from South America, the only honeybees we have here have all been brought over from Africa and Asia and Europe.
Yeah.
So, but there are a lot of bees. But there are different, there's different kinds of bumblebees, there's minor bees that live in the ground, there's leafcutter bees, mason bees, there's carpenter bees, there's a bunch of, other
So
kinds.
when people find bees making a hive in their eaves or something,
So that would be, the thing about bees is that even though they're sort of domesticated, I mean, people have been working with bees for thousands of years, they're still pretty wild because we can't, the way that the mate is in the air, the queen flies up in the air, 30 to 60 feet up in the air, and mates with all the drones from every hive for about 6 miles around. And so there's a lot, she's promiscuous, and it provides, nature provides that way by making sure there's no inbreeding. And so as a result, because one of the big problems with domestication of animals is inbreeding, and that hasn't happened to the bees. So they're still somewhat wild, pretty wild, and they can survive usually pretty well on their own. And so they'll get out of a hive and they'll go and they may find some cavity that seems comfortable to them, and that might be the eaves in your home. And that's where those come from, basically. It's interesting, even though pollinators in general are in decline and we've had having problems with bees and beekeepers are losing a lot of bees, beekeepers have learned, and because we're trying to stay in business and we're passionate about bees, the number of bees in the United States has actually increased over the last 10 years. Because beekeepers have gotten really good at dividing the colonies that survive to make up for the ones that lose. And the price of honey went up, the price of pollination services have gone up. So there's a big incentive for beekeepers to have more bees, and it's been working. Beekeepers are having to work extra hard, do a lot more work, a lot more treatments, and a lot more money involved, so it's not as profitable as it used to be. But beekeepers are holding their own so far. My concern is for all the wild bees, the native bees. That we don't have an army of people out there caring for them, feeding them, taking care of them when they get sick and diseased, and giving them a home to live in. And so we're seeing big reductions in the native pollinators, and so we're going to have to change the way we do things. We're not headed for a good place, I think. Other questions? Yeah.
Can you tell us the benefits of honey for humans?
Oh my God, I could do a whole hour talk just on that.
How much time should we take?
Really? It's like, honey's like a first aid kit in a jar. I mean, yes, it's a sweetener, a wonderful sweetener. It's got vitamins and minerals and nutrients in it, unlike white sugar. Maple's a good one too, and molasses, they also have minerals and stuff. But honey is also a medicine.
Yeah.
I don't know where this is. Basically, it's really good for cuts and wounds and infections. It can help people with insomnia, sore throats, coughs. I could go on and on.
Elderberries.
Oh yeah, that's
Make
great.
elderberry syrup
Yep.
with it,
Yep.
with cinnamon. Yeah.
Elderberry and cinnamon, wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's the best tasting medicine you can eat.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Question in the back?
Actually, honey, if you burn yourself, it works like magic.
It does. In most countries, it is the standard burn treatment. And when you use honey to treat your burns, you don't get the kind of scarring and discoloration of the skin typically that's so common with most standard treatments, at least in this country. The FDA has recently kind of started to come around, and they have approved one type of honey known as Manuka. It's sold as Medi honey. It's like $150 a pound or something, but it's all sterilized and irradiated and all approved for use in the medical. But you can get honey now in a hospital. And in fact, they find very often with patients that have infections and lesions that aren't healing, and they do everything they do, nothing works, they put honey on it, it tends to heal right up. It's amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. And people have been using honey for healing for hundreds, thousands of years. I mean, this is old tradition. Yeah, great preservative, exactly. Honey is the only food that in its natural state will never spoil. It's actually been documented. They found honey in tombs in the Egyptian pyramids, right near the pyramids. The tomb raiders were in there, and they found this big vase, and they opened it up. It was full of honey, and they stick in their fingers, and they're tasting it, and one of them, they found there's a hair on their finger, and they're like, what's going on? They look, in the bottom of this vase was a small child that had been preserved upon death in the honey. Thousands of years ago, the honey was fine, and the child was very well preserved. In some countries, in fact, that's how they preserve meats. They'll stick it in a container of honey, because the honey will prevent any nothing harmful to humans can grow in honey. Nothing. It's such a safe food to eat. It's great. Yes?
Ross Arden, beekeepers who transport their hives around the country to take care of the pollination, do they also make honey with those bees, or is that sort of their own job, or is that the whole job for those bees, and they don't make honey that's then commercial?
It's variable. Beekeepers are very independent, and everyone kind of does their own thing. So there are some beekeepers where all they do is pollination. Some beekeepers, they'll do both. They might do some pollination, and then they might also make some honey. It all depends. It's hard to say. It also depends on the year. Every year is different. Depends on the weather, the health of the crop, the health of the bees, as to how much or whether you'll even get any honey. Some years you don't.
Does Champlain Valley transport their
Champlain Valley apiaries.
Yeah.
I don't think they're doing much now. Years ago when I worked with them, we did some just local here in the Champlain Valley and across the lake a little bit with the apple orchards. We would pollinate during the spring. But just keeping it local. A lot less stressful on the bees, less stressful on the beekeeper. Yes?
How about the Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, used for cabbage worms?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming that's bad for bees?
No, well, BT, this is different from the BT toxin, which is in genetically engineered plants often, where the actual toxin is produced by the plant, so every part of the plant, again, is systemic, and so the plant becomes toxic. The BT that you're referring to is a microorganism. And when you put it on a plant, it doesn't hurt anything until it's consumed by the caterpillars. And in the environment within the digestive system of the caterpillar, it produces these crystalline type toxins that kill the caterpillar. So they're not harmful to other things. It's been a wonderful thing that organic beekeepers, organic farmers have been able to use. But unfortunately, the effectiveness has been declining because of these genetically engineered plants that use the BT toxin itself, not the microorganism, has accelerated the development of resistance in pests, and made it so it's not always as effective as it used to be. Yes, Claire?
Being we have an audience here that is interested in doing the very best that we can, and you can see everybody is really interested in and willing to do whatever they can. Pretty soon, now that it's spring, everybody is going to go out and start buying flowers or seeds, and how can we determine if the seeds have been treated or if they have not been treated, or if the plants are already contaminated and no good, shouldn't be planted? And how do we inform the people that we're buying the plants from what they should be doing and not doing, and put our clout behind it? Can you
That's a good question.
illuminate us on that?
So when you're buying seeds, when you're buying plants, how can you be sure they're not treated with these systemic pesticides and chemicals? And sometimes you can't. That's been an issue because so far there's no labeling requirements. That is something that has been talked about a little bit in Montpelier, but I don't think anything has actually happened. There have been some environmental groups that have had campaigns to try to convince some of the big box retailers that sell lots of plants to start selling plants that aren't treated, because it is a problem. Some people are buying plants that they think are beneficial for pollinators, but they've been treated with these systemic pesticides that harm the pollinators.
Yeah, if we're buying the bad stuff, then we're not.
Right. So it really comes, again, the more local you can get.
How can we be instrumental in changing that?
Well, the more local you can buy your plants and seeds, the better. If you know the person that grew them, you can talk to them and find out how were those plants treated. Did they use pesticides, or what kind did they use if they used them? Are they systemic, so they're still in the plant, or are they just like the thing that kind of degrades over time or not? those are some of the things you do. Of course, if you can buy organic seeds, we've got a great organic seed producer here in Vermont.
Locally, what do we have for organic seeds?
They're over in the Hardwick area. High mowing seeds. They do a wonderful job. And we've got all kinds of seeds that you can get that are certified organic, so you know they have not been treated with anything. Basically, they're just the seed. And in fact, there is a bill currently under consideration in the legislature that would require seed sellers in the state that offer treated seed to also offer non-treated seed. Because right now, one of the problems the farmers are having is they can't get non-treated seed even if they wanted to. It's just not available. Corn, soy, whatever, those kind of seed, they're just not available. So if we can at least make it available so farmers then have a choice, we can maybe, because other researchers have actually shown that these pesticides aren't even that effective I mean, they kill the insects, but they don't make a difference when the researchers look at crops that are treated without the pesticide compared to with. They don't see a big difference in the yields. You basically get the same. So they've been sold to the farmers, and a lot of the information the farmers get only come from the pesticide seller and the seed dealers. And they're not always getting all the information. They get it from one side. And so they're not realizing that in some cases they may not need to be using them because they use them every year whether they know they need it or not. It's a prophylactic use. It's always on the seed. And they don't even know they may not even have the pest, but they're using the pesticide anyway because it comes with the seed. They don't even have a choice. So if we can at least give farmers a choice, that would be a good start. So, if you can talk to your legislator and let them know that you would support that thing, if you think that's a good idea, and try to encourage them to support that bill, the pollinator protection bill, that would be helpful.
And ask the gardener suppliers.
Talk to your garden suppliers. Sure.
And also, everybody practically is going to be buying some sort of weed killer or bug killer. And what should we be aiming for, and what should we stay away from?
Well, if you ask me, we should be staying away from all of those chemicals, because all the chemicals have an effect, some more or some less, but all the pesticides are really, that's what they're for, they're to kill things.
Especially Roundup.
Yep, and all of that. So, there's all kinds of ways to control pests and weeds and things without having to use chemicals. Yeah, it may take a little extra thought or a little extra effort, or sometimes maybe a little extra money, but we don't have to use the chemicals if we choose not to. It all comes down to a choice, because ultimately, the way the system is supposed to work, what we spend our money on, we get more of. What we don't spend our money on goes away, unless they get bailed out. That's how the system's supposed to work, right, with the capitalist system. So you think about whenever we go to the store, right, you're voting with your dollars for the kind of world you want. If you want more of something, that's what you should be buying. If you don't think something we want more of, then don't spend your money on that. But try not to support that.
And the potting soil that we buy, is that already contaminated?
It all depends. Some producers of potting soil do a better job than others. It's really difficult. It's difficult. There's not a lot of regulation. There's not a lot of labeling. And it's hard for the consumer to really know. And that's, again, why local is so important. With local, you can talk to the person, you can meet them, you could go visit their farm, their operation, and see what they're up to, and then you know the quality. You get an idea from the person, and you see. And that's probably, to me, that's the best. Okay, question?
I'd say that compost is another one that's, you just did municipal composting, you really gotta watch that that doesn't have contaminated plants.
Yeah, I know up in Burlington they had an issue with that a couple of years back with some kind of a pesticide got into the compost. It was a problem.
So I think, again, I'm sure they're working on it, but it's...
We're trying to change our culture.
Right.
That's what we're talking about here, okay? We have to change our culture and change most everything we do. And so there's going to be bumps in the road, and we're not going to get everything perfect all the time, but we got to keep working on it. and we got to keep talking about it and keep moving forward as quickly as possible, especially in terms of the climate situation, because physics and the way the planet atmosphere works, it doesn't seem like we have a lot of time to figure it out. We got to move pretty quickly when it comes to the greenhouse gases and how we're affecting the climate.
A number of countries in Europe have already decided to outlaw some of the pesticides. Germany, France,
Yep.
England.
Yeah, Europe is way ahead of
We're
us.
way behind.
Even up in Canada, they're restricting some of those neonicotinoid pesticides in particular because they're so common. That's the one most people are focusing on. But again, really all pesticides are a problem.
So do we need to become politically,
Yeah, we, you know, democracy is a wonderful thing if people take advantage of it. You have to be involved, you have to be informed, you have to vote. That's what it's all about. People have fought and died so we could live in a democracy, and hardly, most of us don't even take advantage of it and vote. To me, that.
We have a good clue here, I think.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'm not just talking to you.
That we have quite a bit of literature over there on that table. And I don't know if I should mention what it is. I have some samples here, and I would like everybody to take whatever they can.
Are those the seeds?
Well,
Those are June.
Oh, okay.
I'll show you what we have. Do more to help these
Oh, some handouts.
handouts.
Do you want to leave them here by the table so
There's
people can grab
some
them?
over there.
Oh, there's some in the back there,
Right now.
okay.
Watch your feet,
So you
please,
can
don't fall.
Harmonics, harmony, please.
Yep. So there's a bunch of handouts available, and you can check out the information from the AAUW and the artwork in the back, and I thank you all for coming.
I wanted to say that it's really, really, really easy to have
And then there are some
gardens
places
and
like-
grow things without pesticides or any kind of poison or anything like that. It's really easy. We've been advertised to death to use harmful things in the garden or else it won't, but it's really easy. The other thing is when you buy plants that aren't hybridized. Buy ones that don't say Miss Madame Rosita on them because
Put Rose and Rosita together.
they've been hybridized for color maybe or size or length of bloom. But meanwhile, what's been sacrificed is pollen, and that's the food for the pollen. So they might grow fine, but the bees won't.
And she knows what she's talking about because she cares for the lovely garden they have here behind the garden, and in the front too.
Right.
Thank you for all your efforts.
Well, you've done the transitional talk, which was wonderful. Thank you, Rob. Wow, there's just so much to absorb. And I wanted to say at the bottom of your email, you have this, and I think it's great. We don't have to engage in grand, heroic actions to participate in the process of change. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world. How is it? And I think that's great. So he's given us lots of ideas, and we have to go and talk to people. As he mentioned, there's refreshments over here, some information, little things about what pesticides you don't buy, any of them, but anyway, information about AEW. Anybody that has a tag, name tag, that says their name on it, I just didn't get one, but we're members of AEW, so if you're interested in finding out about that, that's fine. And thank you for coming. We really appreciate you being here.
And